a race that was cut short, a safety failure from the FIA, and sheer confusion at the end of the race, with a world champion crowned in unusual circumstances. There's so much to talk about here, so let's get into my 5 things we learned from the Japanese Grand Prix. My name's Andy, and this is Behind the Drive. It turns out he is the world champion. Verstappen had a distinct advantage today as he was leading the race and therefore had no spray to contend with in the wet. But that doesn't take away from the fact that Max Verstappen was racing in another lead today. He was 27 seconds ahead of Charles Leclerc and Sergio Perez as they crossed the finish line after 28 laps. That was basically a second per lap that he was faster than the other drivers. What an incredible achievement for the world champion driver. Throughout the entirety of the race, the commentary team were discussing the number of points for the different amount of laps to be completed, and this makes sense. The point of the shortened race, resulting in fewer points, is to avoid a fiasco like Belgium last year, but the fact it goes out of the window when the race finishes in the time limit is something that seems like not very many people knew. What resulted was one of the strangest championship announcements I've ever seen, with Verstappen still not quite believing it himself in the cool-down room. For me, I really believe that he's had one of the most incredible and dominant seasons in F1 history. Verstappen's championship this year is massively deserved, and the performance that he's put in this weekend, with all the changeable conditions, has shown his quality. Whenever he's out at the front, he's one of the most difficult drivers to get past, and this year, more often than not, he's managed to overtake early and hold the lead of the race. It's a huge achievement for Red Bull to go back-to-back in the Drivers' Championship through a huge change in regulations. And to do it all at Honda's home Grand Prix in Japan as well is a huge result from them as they saw Formula 1 returning to the country for the first time since 2019. It may well be the beginning of a dominant era for Red Bull and Verstappen as the team seems to have a distinct advantage in these new regulations. The genius of Adrian Newey to create such a strong car with the ground effect is simply incredible. So it will take a lot for the teams to take the fight to Verstappen and Red Bull in the years to come. So of course, it's a green box for Verstappen for a brilliant weekend and a brilliant season. His task for the rest of the year is surely to break the race win record and continue to add his name to the most elusive records in Formula 1. The timings of the Japanese Grand Prix need to change. This was the first F1 race in Japan since 2019, and clearly a lot has changed since then. However, the timing of the Grand Prix in the calendar year has not. The race at Suzuka has tended to happen around this time each year. Now this is a problem, as it coincides with typhoon season when the weather conditions tend to be changeable, just as we saw today. This is something that is normal, but it creates difficult conditions for racing. On top of this, you have a problem with the light, which is fairly unique to Japan as the sun sets just 4 hours or so after the race begins. Now this shouldn't be an issue given the 3-hour time limit, but let's say hypothetically the start of the race had been delayed, just as it was in Singapore last week. The 3 hours wouldn't have been able to happen after the restart of the race. According to Andrew Benson, since Liberty Media took ownership of Formula 1, the organisers have wanted to reorganise the race to host it earlier in the year, where the risk of these kinds of conditions is lower. Perhaps this is driven by environmental concerns, wanting to put the race closer to Australia, for example. However, the organisers themselves aren't keen to move. Perhaps the reason for this is simply because they enjoy the fact that the Grand Prix at Suzuka has crowned 12 champions over the years, and now 13. Of course, having the championship being in a position where it could be the place where the championship ends is certainly a good thing, and there will be more attention on the race and more people considering going to Japan for the event. Now, I appreciate this is exactly what the organisers want, but the Suzuka race in itself is great, and wherever the event is on the calendar, I think there will be a lot of attention anyway. So moving it to a better time of year would just mean that there's a better chance of the race being completed and avoiding these kinds of broken up events. So I'm going to go for an amber box for the timings of this event. I think it should be moved to an earlier starting point if it's going to happen at this time of the year, and I think it should be moved to an earlier point in the calendar. But while these things are very clear in hindsight, I think it could be unfair to give a red box on this occasion. Before we take a look at Gasly's incident, I want to take a moment to ask you to consider subscribing to the channel. I'm aiming for 60,000 subscribers by the end of the year, which is pretty punchy, so if you haven't already, please do subscribe. FIA safety protocols failed or do not exist. It took less than 5 minutes before the first red flag, as there were many lap 1 incidents to sort, with Sainz off into the barrier and Albon retiring in a similar location. Through that, as we know, Pierre Gasly collected an advertising board that had been thrown away by the barrier in Sainz's impact. As a result, Gasly was rightfully going slow to get to the pits and replace his front wing. It was already disappointing to see the Rolex board being thrown across into the oncoming traffic, but I think this is normal. Perhaps making them out of a more breakable material such as polystyrene in the future could be a better option, but this was nothing compared to what happened next. As the cars were collected by the safety car on the lead lap, Gasly dropped back. Not only because he was going slow with the advertising board, but because of his pit stop as well. So as the cars had gone through, a tractor then came onto the circuit. Under normal safety car conditions, cars that have dropped back go at a moderate pace to catch up with the pack. Once all the cars have been collected, that means that there's a decent amount of time to recover the cars when the pack is away from the incident. But instead, a tractor to collect the car was driving along the circuit. It's outrageous that a vehicle was given permission to enter the circuit in these conditions and in these circumstances. The race was red flagged almost immediately after that, and perhaps this was a trigger for it as Gasly came onto the radio to complain about how dangerous it was. Formula 1 is fundamentally a dangerous sport, but over time there has been a huge amount of effort invested in improving safety. This is the right thing to do, and Formula 1 learns from each and every incident. Looking back to Suzuka in 2014, where the sport lost one of its best prospects in Jules Bianchi as his Marussia aquaplaned off into the tractor on that day, is a clear example of where they've learned in the past. So why on earth would the race control team allow a vehicle to go out onto the track to recover the car when the cars were not in the safety car queue? And why on earth would they not just wait until the cars have come in with the red flag? To add to this, why on earth did that tractor not have the same brightness of lights that the F1 cars have? On the onboard footage, which is less clear than what the drivers would see, you could barely see the vehicle. That in itself is dangerous. In a statement from the FIA during the red flag period, which might have been related to the advertising board rather than the vehicle, they tried to imply that Gasly was going too quickly to catch up to the safety car. This is wrong. Whenever you're well behind the pack, you have to catch up to the queue, and even if the red flag was deployed, Gasly needs to get himself back to the pits. Sure, Gasly is required to stick to the safety car and red flag delta, but he does need to catch up with the rest of the field as well. Even at low speeds as well, you can aquaplane, just as we saw from Sebastian Vettel on the start-finish straight when he was trying his best to get up to racing speed. Plus, if there's a red flag, there's no reason at all to not wait until the cars are in the pit lane, so it's safe for the vehicle to go out. The FIA have given Gasly a penalty for exceeding the speed limit under red flags. Now, it's fair to say he was going very fast, and to be fair, the penalty's probably justified, but it does feel like the governing body were purely looking for a scapegoat, which is outrageous. F1 used to be the pinnacle of safety. The investigations were thorough and were always completed with a view to improve in the future. Now it feels like it's becoming a blame game, which is dangerous at the best of times. There are always many factors that lead to incidents, and quite frankly, the FIA needs to look in the mirror, in my opinion. Gasly is rightfully angry. The other drivers are rightfully angry as well, and I think we as Formula 1 fans are right to be angry too. There's so much to learn from this incident alone, but the worst part of it is the fact that it implies that the FIA haven't applied the lessons learned from the past. This is something that they've historically been very good at, but to see this incident today implies that the sport has gone backwards. Personally, I think it was right to start the race when they did. It was a shame that the time was then lost under the red flag conditions and it meant that we didn't get a full Grand Prix. But it's an inexcusable mistake to let a vehicle be on the circuit when there's a car catching up to the safety car queue. I think that either a safety protocol was not followed today or the right protocols do not exist for this kind of situation. There's a lot to learn from this, but I think it's certainly a red box for the FIA. Sebastian Vettel's last Suzuka Showdown. Sebastian Vettel had his final race weekend in Japan, and it was incredibly eventful for the driver that won his 2011 World Championship at this very circuit. He might not be quite as competitive as he would have liked this year, but his Q3 qualifying appearance was impressive in the dry conditions as he took 9th on the grid. The start of the race was tricky for Vettel though, as he was aquaplaning down the start-finish straight and ended up colliding with Alonso into turn 1, which spun him around and sent him to the back of the order. But Vettel took a risk to swap onto the intermediate tyres early at the restart, as he had nothing to lose being at the back of the order. And the pace that he had was impressive, as he ended up running 6th after the other drivers made their stops. The clear track and the intermediate tyres created a huge advantage for the German driver, but this was returned with Vettel having to defend with his Aston Martin car throughout, to the extent that he only kept it ahead of Alonso by a fraction of a second by the end. This race weekend seemed to be very nostalgic for Vettel. His family was there, he made many positive comments about the circuit and how much he enjoys it there as well. It's brilliant to see Vettel performing well and scoring a strong haul of 8 points for Aston Martin as they close the gap further to Alfa Romeo in the Constructors' Championship. They're now just 7 points behind, with momentum absolutely in their favour, so it will be a great close to the year for them. But it can't not be a green box for Vettel for an awesome performance this weekend, with a great strategy and a strong result. Alpine will be thankful that the race got full points. Alpine have done an impressive job in Suzuka to turn the tables on McLaren after such a tricky race in Singapore last weekend with a double retirement. Alpine had lost 4th in the standings after last week, but they fought back with their cars and qualified 5th and 7th in the standings, with McLaren 10th and 11th. With those positions, that would have been a 15-point swing in favour of Alpine, so the pressure was on McLaren for the race. Once it got underway, the Alpines maintained that advantage, with McLaren's finding it difficult to make progress through the field in the wet conditions. Meanwhile, the Alpine cars were fighting. Ocon was defending from Hamilton through the entirety of the race as he was positioning his car brilliantly and had the straight line speed advantage over the works Mercedes. Meanwhile, Alonso, who was even leading the race at one point before he stopped, took a risk after getting frustrated behind Vettel as he stopped for a fresh set of intermediate tyres, which gave him a massive advantage over his rivals. It probably came a lap too late for Alonso in the end, as while he caught up to Vettel, he crossed the line 11/100th of a second behind the Aston Martin. That 4th and 7th result was 18 points, with McLaren taking just 1, so a 17-point swing in the standings, which has put Alpine 13 points ahead with 4 rounds to go. This battle looks like it's going down to the wire, and it will be great to see what happens next with these final rounds. But of course it's a green box for Alpine's performance today. Honourable mentions. A few honourable mentions today, the first of which goes to Nicholas Latifi. Through all of the confusion and the fact that he got lost in FP2, it's difficult to even realise that he's taken his first 2 points of the season after he benefited from an early pit stop onto the intermediates. I'd also like to mention Kevin Magnussen, a driver that only finished 14th, and I'm sure there were many great moves that the TV feed didn't show, but some of the moves the Danish driver made in the wet conditions were simply incredible. It was a joy to watch, and I think he must be a fearless driver. So there we have it, another champion crowned in Japan, and although we didn't get the full race distance, there was an awful lot to take from that race, and what an achievement for Verstappen. It feels like a new era of dominance has begun.